And so our first talk today is by Gaudry Troché from the Globe Institute at the University of Copenhagen. And he is going to be giving us a guided tour in the LC-MS-MS-based paleo-proteomics village. So if you want to share your screen.
Yes, I made up the title because I had no clue what to say, but you're going to be surprised because there's a new subject. You don't see the presenter mode, do you? No.
No, that's perfect.
Okay, I just moved that around. Okay, good. Yes, and instead, it's going to be about bovids. No, I'm joking. I have no clue about bovids. Just to make people jealous of what we can see around Copenhagen at 5-minute walk. But I think some people would be able to say which one are bovids. Definitely not me. But yeah, that's my neighbors. Oh, the keyboard not on. Okay, no, instead, it's going to be about what I'm more doing and my training. So it's more about mass spectrometry. And I'm not really, I don't know, I'm not really trained or skilled for making a very theoretical presentation on mass spectrometry in general. So I have focused it a little bit more. So for people who have never heard about mass spectrometry, I believe it's going to be a bit maybe difficult, but I also assume that it's a paleo-proteomic, whatever PAASTA means, but there should be paleo-proteomic in there. So I think most people have at least a little bit of knowledge about what's going on. And in case you don't, there we are. I came up with a list of, I think, very relevant books or, books, they're all books, because they will explain better than me all of these aspects. The first book, Introduction to Mass Spectrometry, this one is a bit tough. Don't try to read it in the evening before sleeping. It's not something you just read. It's more like if you have a question, you ask yourself, you can try to find it in the book. It's very detailed. There's a bit of math, so it's advanced, but it covers also all the aspects of mass spectrometry in general that I will not do today at all. So that's interesting, and it can give ideas. The second book is much more like readable from the Hoffman. It's like, that's something you can just read. It's not Victor Hugo, but that's kind of a story and so on. So that's pretty cool. I like this kind of hands-on proteomic data analysis book. I think if you're a little bit into coding, you can get into your own de novo script very easily by following the first chapters, and then it starts to be like compiling papers. So it's getting a bit more advanced at the end, but it's always written in a way, and papers that are written in a way that you can reproduce the code in a sense. So it's very interesting. And then chromatography book, this is also a very heavy book. There's another version called The Gradient Illusion from the same two authors here. They're inventors of it, so they know what they're talking about, but the books are very also hard to read. So it's also more something if you want to, let's say, look for something specific in there. Don't try to read it from A to Z. And so today, what I want to talk about is basically optimization, maybe routine optimization that you can do in mass spectrometry when you have a new project coming. I'll try to focus on that. So what can you change if you're in front of the instrument and you're wondering what you could improve for your project and how long it will take? And to illustrate that, this is a plot from chemometrics. I think it's a sampling of coal, and it's simply kind of a sampling design, as you can see here, and there would be the plot of the variance here. They have a function of whatever quartz concentration, but if we just take one value here of 5%, you can see curve 1, and then 2, 3, 4. So basically the relative standard deviation increases from 1, 2, 3, 4. And these 1, 2, 3, 4, what they represent they represent analytical pathways. It's very simple here, it's just resampling. So they have, like, let's say 6 pieces of stones that you sample from. So imagine like 6 pieces next to each other. If you sample all of them once, you would get a relative standard deviation all the way up here. And the idea is if you sample them 3 times and then you only get 3 of these pieces, you get the sample deviation slightly below, and so on and so forth as you resample. And that's just sampling. It's nothing crazy. It's just the analytical process represented. So basically, someone would simply reanalyze one of these very small subsamples will obtain an analytical variance very small compared to someone resampling all the way from the beginning. And so what I'm presenting today is optimization of the very last part of the analytical workflow. So imagine that we're optimizing something that a reanalysis will produce this kind of variance. So it's small parameters. And that's why I want to first talk about this reasonable optimization. There's millions of parameters. It is not worth testing them all because most of them are useless, or they would not represent anything interesting. If you have grant money, time, then you would like to spend it maybe on something that will make more difference than most of the parameters that you can read. And so I will make a small, whatever, red light thingy, color code, where there are parameters that I think are worth, whenever you start a new project, you can try to optimize a little bit. It won't take so much time and it will give good results. Many of the parameters, they're just a complete waste of time. Because they will just, I don't know, like the speed of the needle taking the sample, that's one of the things. It just looks like another row in the method, but it's a useless one. And then there's parameters. There's more like risk that you ruin your sample, or especially if you do a design of experiment, you want some sort of linearity, and some parameters would just yield to no signal, no concentration, and then you just get a bunch of zeros, and it doesn't really help in your analysis afterwards. So it's kind of a risk that then your design all of a sudden is not well organized anymore. And in general, sometimes people are afraid. I don't think you can break a mass spectrometer per se. It will more like break you if it falls down on you than the other way around. So it's not, they're very solid, but it's very simple to ruin your sample, because for any millions of reasons, they cannot work, but the instrument will be fine. And so I have just a small schema for liquid chromatography system, and we're going to go through at least the main parameters, or the main one you would see. And the first is when you choose mobile phases. So the liquid you push through, they are kind of useless. I mean, most people would change between, okay, 2%, 3%, 5% of something in something else. People use methanol, acetonitrile. They would make difference. They would make different ion clusters. They would also make different retention times. So you should not change it on the way, but try another one. I mean, why not if you really want, but there's no big breakthrough. They should be compatible with the instrument afterwards. So small organic molecules, volatile molecules, not something that would burn, or not something that would make salt also in the modifier. But you could see people using formic acid or acetic acid. And I mean, don't include that in your experiment. You will just lose time. And a lot of washes, also washes. And people have always their wash. So they come up with a big mix and they call it the magic wash, and everyone does the same, but it's, I mean, of course you have to wash the needle with the first solvent, the right solvent first, but this is just manufacturer recommendation. It's not even worth trying something else. The autosampler, I think, is the one with most of the ridiculous parameters, with all these needles and these positions. It should be properly calibrated so it gets the right sample at the right place. But other than that, most of the wash cycles, as long as they are in the correct order, which would be anyway default, it's no big worry. Injection volume, at least the protein concentration to some extent, that's important, especially in paleo-proteomics, where you have some samples that goes in all direction, very, very rich and very, very not rich. That could be interesting, or at least a protein concentration measure. So you know kind of how much you inject. That will avoid that you get no signal or way too much or this kind of thing. That would make a difference, especially if you have a project. I think you can expect from a site and from certain degradation, similar, let's say, concentration for all of the samples. Then the pumps, they're all the way down here. They're just down so that the liquid drops in there to make a bit of pressure before the pump. Here, there's not many parameters you can play with. The mixer you can change physically, but it's not usually big deal. Degas, it's usually a good practice to degas the mobile phases, but just playing with the degasser makes no sense. And the pressure is something you read, but you don't really use it. And then you can most people will change their gradient shape. So they will make different shape of gradients from percentage to another percentage or blah, blah, blah. Once again, in proteomics, we all work with the same kind of analytes, which are peptides. They're usually kind of all the same gradients, and you can come with fancy shape if you want. I mean, usually the softwares, they have possibilities to make non-linear gradients with very, very fancy shapes, but that won't really make any difference. So that might even get worse than just a very standard basic linear gradient. And then flow rate, I think flow rate is one of the things that makes sense. And if you go to the column, I think I'll go straight away to that because it's something you usually change with the column diameter. So you keep the same speed in the column and like few centimeter per second or something like that for a packed column. And this makes sense because going to very low flow rate and very narrow columns, that provides better sensitivity. But it's also like usually lower throughput. So it kind of depends of what you want to do, but at least if you want very high throughput, you would like a larger flow rate. So that's one of the things you can also investigate for your project. Let's say, what kind of sensitivity do you need? Do you need very high sensitivity? Sometimes you don't need high sensitivity. So that's how you can decide on kind of flow rate, column diameter. The length is also a little tricky. At least you should maximize it usually. But at some point it will reach the pressure limit. So it's, of course, don't go above because that won't just work. But you can play with that. You can increase column lengths. Usually short columns are good for short gradients and long column for longer gradients. But once again, you can also like just play yourself with it. So that's something you can do. The problem is you have to buy columns, right? Or like pack them with different lengths, and that can be like a lot of work. And then the rest, like chemistry, as long as you stay with something hydrophobic, then it won't make any big difference because it's not targeted analysis. So you're looking at simultaneously thousands of peaks, so it doesn't really make sense anyway to look at them individually. Particle diameters, usually people use sub 2 microparticles, even 3 microparticles. That won't be game breaker. It depends a bit on the architecture of the particle and their shape distribution, but they are usually not parameters you're told before you just buy the column and try it. So I don't really assume that it would make a big change. I mean, very large particles, they would not be suitable, but I mean, they wouldn't be really recommended anyway. So, but someone would say maybe smaller particles are better in general, and then they're like, oh, this is 1.5 and the other one are 1.6, so 1.5 is better, but it's most likely not true. Same for the manufacturer. I mean, they show whatever plot they want and they all look better than others, but I mean, they are quite expensive, so it's not worth buying all the manufacturers just to test. And the temperature is the same. It's one of the things you cannot cool down, but you can heat up, and you can heat up to, depends, sometimes up to almost 100 degrees, but it's kind of burning the column at some point, and it's usually just to release a bit the pressure, but it's not big parameter either. So there's not many things in the chromatography, to be honest. It's a bit boring. The only red thing is separation mode. You have to go, if you start doing ion exchange or normal phase chromatography, that's a completely different world, and I think most people don't do that. So you're kind of alone here. So usually people stick to reverse phase chromatography with hydrophobic columns. That works for peptides, and then usually good starting point. And even if you don't know what you're doing, you should end up with results. So that's, let's say, safe condition. The second, I'm 12 minutes, perfect. Second thing, the ion source here is a much more red things. So in the ion source of the instrument, you don't usually change it. You don't usually change mode. There's many people zooming around here, I think, like doing moldy. They also won't really change and doing, I don't know, you can spray directly on the surface instead of a laser, but that's, I mean, you're gonna spend your life on doing that. And in electrospray, so it's very suitable for LCMS. Voltage and the needle itself, there are things that are worth trying. The needle is more like the size of it that should really fit with the flow rate. And the voltage is really game breaker. That's really a big parameter. I mean, at 0, nothing happens. At, I don't know, 5,000, it can spark. So it's something you can really get bad results if it's not well tuned, but also like a change of few hundred volts that could make a big difference. So that's interesting, and it's more something that you change together with your mobile phase or to like composition, but you can also play with the sample with that. That's very fast to switch and to optimize. So that's That's why I put it here, because it's very fast to optimize, let's say. The polarity is more complex, right? It will make different ions also. You have to search the phi differently. It could be fun to try on top of positive, like negative mode, but you have to change everything, all the mobile phase and all of that. So it's a big pain. Then in the actual electrospray, you have 3 gases usually. They have completely different names for all the manufacturers. You have a gas coming out of the MS and pushing whatever comes in out, because the MS is in the vacuum, so otherwise everything gets in. So the idea is to push neutral things out. So you have this shield gas. You have that spray gas. So it's an electrospray, but it's still a normal spray. So you still need air to like push it through. And then you have a exhaust gas sometimes. It would just like pass around on the bottom here. People doing microflow and nanoflow usually put all the 3 to 0 because it's just such a small flow rate that it's not very useful. But at some point with microflow or higher flow rate, it's interesting to change them, but very reasonably, because they're absolutely not game breaker either. And then the last things you should not play with is these temperatures in there, because they take time to settle down. When you change temperature in the instrument, that changes the vacuum, and that takes a couple of minutes / hours. And then you have this cone voltage. There's also like different names with different manufacturers, but that's usually something to do in source fragmentation. So it's not something you would like to usually do routinely. And yeah, again, the type of ionization you don't want to change. And then on the last part, the mass spectrometer, and let's say in the method of the mass spectrometer, both are DDA or DIA. Here you can play with many things. It might sound paradoxical. People might be afraid of touching this, but I think it's where you can play with many things. The mass range, the resolution, and let's say amount of ions you inject. I mean, there are things you can really tune, and with Exploris or with like even time of flight instrument, this amount of ions and mass range that can affect the time the instrument cycles. So you can actually, when you go on shorter gradient, cycle a bit more fast, or if you want more MS2, you can cycle more fast and then decrease the mass range or the resolution or the number of ions. So on the time of flight, you would simply decrease the number of pulses that you average. And then you get a bit faster analysis. So that's something you can play with also when you design your experiment. And in the MS2 experiment, well, the mass range is no longer important because it depends on the mass range of the MS1 and it calculates it. And same for collision energy, it's just like a moving value. So usually don't put anything here. But you can also play with a couple of things, including resolution, amount of ion. The charge is also game breaker, like, because usually the instrument will exclude +1 ions. And if you have very short peptides, +1 usually have some peptides. But usually it would exclude the +1 ions. So don't worry if you don't find +1 ions in your whatever max quant search, it's just excluded. But resolution also, that's something you don't need a lot, especially in MS2. So you can cycle a bit faster maybe if you want to decrease the resolution. That could be interesting something to try. The isolation width is more DIA problem, but in DDA usually just 1 Dalton, but in DIA you can also like play with that isolation width. That could be, especially in ancient samples, with deamidation important, because deamidation is just a very small mass shift, so it might actually be, and might not be a big retention time chain on a short gradient, so they might just be together, all the deamidated and not deamidated ion. So that's also something you can change. And kind of conclusion remarks are like more on the design itself. If you build up an experiment to optimize a bit parameters in your LC-MS, in mass spectrometry, most of them you can do 1 parameter at a time, because you can just infuse your mobile phase. And then if you infuse your mobile phase with even like just 1 synthetic peptide, you can optimize simultaneously almost all the parameters. And that would be a good value if it's a quite average peptide, like normal length, let's say the average length, and you just make an average gradient composition, you would still have like a bunch of re-optimized numbers. So it's something it's worth doing. It doesn't take much long. And for the liquid chromatography, it's a bit more a mess, because 1 parameter at a time, there would be a lot of experiment, but they will also all be with different settings. So you might have to go hands-on for every single condition and screw and stuff like that. So sometimes design of experiment, you can remove some of the points there, so it can gain a lot of time, but it's not big changes either. So you might end up overfitting with some big models or main parameters. That's usually enough. And computer simulation that also exists, and it's very simple to program it yourself. Chromatography is very simple, very boring. It's just Gaussian peaks moving, so it's easy to program. And usually there's softwares like DryLab, and you just input experimental results that you have before, and it can predict for you like best chromatography. So that's at least no need of sample preparation and all of these things. And in general, because once again, we are in a scenario where you would change small things, right? There would be a small variance gain. You really need very predefined goals, because otherwise it might be completely inconclusive at the end, just because changing a parameter just looks like a little bit better, but not so much. So you really need to have defined goals, like you want to increase peptide count or resolution or something specifically, because otherwise it might be difficult to even say which setup is the best. And multivariate analysis I would avoid, because you're most likely going to overfit, because once again, it's so small changes of whatever condition that you might also blur everything. And you can also just end up with different methods, right? And there's maybe a method that is better for something you would say as post-translational modification, method is better for peptide count or something like that. And you don't want to blur them by like reducing dimension too much. And usually just even plot one parameter at a time change, that could be enough for publications. So it's usually not outstanding changes that you will get, but not so much time on optimizing. So I hope that will help in the future. And I go back to the first slide, is my favorite, with the flying sheep.
Great, thank you. That was super interesting. If anybody has any questions, they can either put their hands up and then unmute themselves, or they can put it in the chat and we can read it out. So if anyone has anything to ask, pop your hand up. I do have a question, first of all. So you just said in terms of your optimization, you tend to change one parameter at a time. So when you're working on a new project and a new site, do you tend to sort of run a few samples and then optimize the settings on a few samples first before you run all of your samples, or do you run them and then are you kind of going off experience, or are you testing them each site that you have?
Yeah, so that's the point. I think it's different places in the instrument, like all of these guys here. So whatever happens in the source of the instrument, and at least these ones, they can be optimized one at a time, simply because you would only use not even your sample. You will just use your mobile phase, and then they will the instrument will just figure it out itself, because it will change with your mobile phase composition, but not necessarily with your sample. So that's why they're very short to optimize, especially the voltage here. And that can help. So that's why it's one parameter at a time, because usually the instrument would also change these three and might even change these two. But in 1 second or something, you won't even see it. So it's, and then when you start either on the chromatography, let's say here, these are parameters you need to inject your sample to see. So that's why one parameter at a time, there would be a lot of experiment and they will take a lot of time, while these ones, it's a lot of experiment, but they take a millisecond each of them. So that's why one parameter at a time here, and the interaction parameters, blah, 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 they don't really make sense. The problem also in making, let's say, sample wise here, is that some of these values, they might like, you would like maybe like increasing values of, let's say, especially the temperature, you would like it to increase because it increases fast, but it doesn't decrease very fast. And if you have a design of experiment, you don't necessarily want to control like which, that might be incompatible, right, at some point. So, but yeah.
Zandra, go ahead.
So I'm going to ask a very wide question for you. Say that you start to work in a new lab with a new mass spec, and you run a sample that you think it has proteins in it. but you don't really get any good results. What is the first thing you start to optimize?
Yeah, it sounds more like troubleshooting issue. I mean, there's many steps that cannot work, but so usually you would start anyway not running a sample, right? And running something you have a little of knowledge about, something you used to run, quality control, something like that, and that will help a lot. So at GPR we have HeLa cells, so it's like cancer cell. It's nothing to see with what we're doing, but at least it just gives an idea if the instrument performs. I mean, if that works and your sample doesn't work, then I'm sorry to say that's most likely on the sample size or like sample preparation eventually. But I mean, it's also likely that both do not work, right? And then what can get wrong usually. So we have examples here. We have the mass spectrometer just hidden here or here, and all the liquid chromatographies, they usually work less than these because they have moving parts and they have like liquid going around, so they can leak easily, and you have to screw stuff and blah blah blah. So I mean, usually the problem is here. So, but it's hard to know, and sometimes you never find, or you take days to find out. So it's not necessarily simple, but yeah, the chromatography, that's like usually the problem because it's moving things and seals, and so yeah, usually the mass spectrometer is fine, but
That's good to know. Thank you. So I'm guessing that is what you're doing when we have shitty samples for you.
yeah, you usually cross fingers, but sometimes it's not enough, right? So then yeah, you might get hints on what's not working, but that's a bit yeah, that will be even a whole presentation on troubleshooting, and it's kind of a boring science, I would say, about, you know, definitely one parameter at a time change, repeating the error, putting things back and forth, and usually very, very disappointing results, like a lot of time, but not much results, let's say.
Yeah, ahead.
Which parameter do you think might be the best for paleo-proteomics to change?
Compared to like a modern proteomic experiment?
Yeah.
I think, first of all, people have a tendency to go very high throughput, right? So they would, and we don't necessarily need that, right? Because you don't necessarily have so many samples in paleo-proteomics. So that orientation of very high flow rates and very short columns, that might not be so ideal, I would say, for us, because we don't have so much material. So we want to get most out of it. So, and people like proteomics, right, they do single cell, so they need to have large cohorts or like patients or things like that. So I think it's a wrong direction they take here. I mean, that we should not maybe take. Here, not much. What do we have here? Yeah, DIA also for us, it's a bit tricky, right, because of our PTMs. And then in DDA, I mean, they're getting away of DDA, right? But I think the instrument can still do it very well. But yeah, what else would we change in here? Chromatography, maybe. I would go for just a longer gradient, smaller column, like smaller diameter, something sensitive, I suppose.
Thanks.
As no one's got their hand up, I'm going to ask another question. When choosing between DDA and DIA, what are the things that we should be considering?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in principle, on paper, DIA was initially aimed for, so people in modern proteomics, they have, let's say, a lot of people, like they have, let's say, a disease, they want to find markers, so they have a very large number of people. And the problem is they want to quantify, let's say, the same protein through everyone. So they're rather interested in having less peptides, but to have it in all the samples, in all the patients, so they can see if it's going up and down, basically. And it's not so much the case in paleo-proteomics. Like quantification, absolute quantification is not so important because you don't want to see a deregulation of like a small variation of protein concentration. So DIA in that sense is not super interesting. What's interesting in DIA is that you use these libraries. So you use, let's say, you need this prior information in the peptides, but you have basically a list of peptides that you're looking for. And that list is somehow much shorter than in DDA when you just digest your database. But at least in DIA, you ensure that these peptides are checked. And when you know that in ancient samples, some peptides are very important because they can reveal like sex or they can reveal like species, it can also be very interesting to ensure that some of the peptides that you are very interested in, they are included, because in paleo-proteomics also many peptides are useless and you just keep on acquiring them like thousands of times, and it's a boring region of your proteome. So I think it's kind of a balance in that, having at least good libraries where you can screen the peptides you're very interested in, but per se the DIA is not so interesting because you would get less peptides, especially for ancient samples, because they are not predicting very well like all the PTMs and all of that.
Do you have any further questions? Or any other more general topics that people want to discuss? Okay. Well, what we are going to do is send around or put a sign-up sheet on Slack. So if you have a topic that you want to present on, then you can use that to put yourself on the list. And we'll be sending a schedule around once we have some names. So this is going to be the first Wednesday of every month. And so thank you very much to Gaudry for being our first presenter of the PAASTA Seminar Series. And we will be seeing everybody hopefully again in a month. Great, thanks very much.